Be it you, your family, your organization, or the world, leadership is critical to your success. Yet, this is an area hugely misunderstood, misinterpreted, and abused by many organizations and leaders. Today, our discussion is about the buzzword leadership. For today's discussion, I call him a humble leader to share his wisdom with us. He is a leadership trainer, TEDx speaker, and a clever author. Please welcome the speaker for the day is Vidusha Nathavitarna. Welcome to the show, Vidusha.
Thank you. Great to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
It's always a pleasure to invite you. You were in my list for a longer time, but I thought this is the right time for me to send out that invitation. If someone watching us wants to know who Vidusha Nathavitarna is, how could you describe yourself?
The bulk of the work I do is about helping people to find out who they really are and fulfill their potential. I think that's the closest I can get in 10 words. It's about. I hate the word trainer. I try to use the word a facilitator of learning, because I think learning is far more important, and training is a very, very small component of that. So I think for today's discussion, that would suffice. I'll get into it later on once you ask your questions.
Excellent. Love your concise answer. As you just rightly mentioned, one thing that I learned throughout my facilitation or training, so-called training career, is that letting people understand what they need to understand is an art than a science, right? So it has definitely science involved, but it's how well you let them experience what they need to learn. That's where the learning happens. It's a discovery than just teaching. Vidusha, I want to start the discussion by looking at the definition of leadership, because what I realize is this: although this has been a buzzword, this is kind of the word that every organization has to utter at one point of time, many days, many times in a given day. One thing that I feel is that we tend to misunderstand and misinterpret the term leadership. To get a start to this talk, can you define leadership? What is leadership for you?
Okay, that's a fantastic place to start, Niroshan, because I think I think you're right. The issue is that we do tend to look at leadership and leaders thereof in very different ways, and interpretations and definitions are important because that gives you a framework to work within, isn't it? So if you get your definition wrong, I think everything else that happens afterwards is wrong. So even in academia, defining something is the starting point of any research paper that you do, isn't it? That's always the start. So, okay. The issue is that there are very, very, very many into leadership. And picking one is very, very difficult, and I try not to also. However, given that you told me to define it, let me try and interpret it the way I see it, right? Rather than from a textbook definition perspective. So the leadership definition that I found most interesting and probably the most practical for the kind of work we do from an organizational perspective is that leadership is a process. Okay. So if you ask what leadership is, most people turn around and say it's a person who drives an organization or a group of people towards a common objective. Now, the moment you say it's a person, you start fixating on one. And that's always the primary issue, right? But the moment you utilize the word process, right, that leadership is a process. Remember that leadership is a verb, right? It's not a noun. So the moment it's a verb, it has to be doing something. And what is it doing? So leadership is about, guiding or facilitating a group of people towards meeting a common objective. The rest of the sentence is fine. But the moment you say leadership is a person who drives or facilitates an organization towards a common objective versus leadership is a process that drives an organization towards a common objective. The two of them makes a stark difference in how you view leadership. Now, the moment you say leadership is a process, by definition itself, whoever is involved in that process, in whatever way, in whichever small contribution they make, by definition itself is a leader. And I think that's what organizations need to understand. So the moment we change that definition, everything flips, right? So imagine if we turn around and say, in any organization, leadership is a process, be involved in that process. So whatever you're doing as an organization, the moment someone's involved in it, by definition itself, you become a leader, and that empowers you. You don't need someone to give you authority at that point. All you need is your involvement and your appreciation of what is taking place. So I think that, to me, makes a huge difference, and it makes all the difference in the world, especially if you're teaching leadership, because that makes every one of us an equal contributor in many ways towards that. So I think that to me is my definition of it. Leadership is a process, and anyone who's involved in that process of ensuring that the organization meets its objectives, whatever the objectives might be, is a leader.
Excellent. I love that. I love that. And I'm just adding this, Vidusha. What triggered me to consider this particular topic for a live talk, is the fact that, of course, it's not a straight line, where we all go through happy times, frustrations, disappointments, whatsoever. So in my journey, one thing I realize is that it's not just about managing people for me, right? As you rightly stated, it's a process for me. What it, how I interpret, or how, my addition to that statement would be, Vidusha, it's managing the system around people. What is your thinking around that? So this is also coming from a trending management mindset called Management 3.0. Anyone who is watching us, just search for this term, Management 3.0. So this is mainly for the agile teams, but it is valid for any organization, any team, right? And I'm a practitioner of that particular mindset and framework. What is believed is that leadership is managing the system around the people, not just the people itself, right? I think where the organizations go wrong is there, right? We think management is about controlling the people around us, right, in our organization. So we put a lot of procedures, we put a lot of guidelines, we put a lot of rules, we give everything that they need. Kind of, we don't understand the management is just facilitating the environment that they need to have.
Let me quietly kind of add a few subtleties into that, right? There is a very real danger in using the word management if you don't quite interpret it right, because there are positive and negative connotations in all of this, right? So imagine this, right? When you talk about systems around people or people around systems, which comes first is the big question. That's number one, right? So, correct. And the other thing is, can you manage it in the first place, or should you manage it? Okay. And I'm not going to get into the discussion of it because I know it's not the thrust of what you want to discuss today, but let me just add this, right? Think of it as an ecosystem. Okay. Think of anything like an ecosystem. And the best example I can give you for an ecosystem is a fish tank, right? So if the fish tank has been set up in a manner, I mean, most people have ornamental fish at some point, and my son just went and got some fish in the morning today. So, it's top of mind for me. So let me give you an example through that, right? So if you set up your fish tank with aerators and, filters and all the rest of it, and have a type of fish that requires a huge amount of effort to keep, versus if you take a look at a river, is also an ecosystem, but it's self-managing, right? So fish tanks is what we try and do inside organization. We create artificial systems with the hope that whoever that is occupying that space thrives. We don't look at it from an organic perspective. Okay. Whereas you don't need to do anything to the river. Of course, unless you went and cut down all the trees like we do around it, right? And dredge it and build dams around it, then of course, yes. Then the whole thing goes to the six. But in its natural setting, you really don't need to do anything to it. The entire species thrives. Now, that is, I think, where you need to draw inspiration from trying to force certain things by looking at something and saying, you know what, let's come in. And this is where I disagree and vehemently oppose, things like best practices, because to me, there aren't anything called best practices, right? What we need to be creating are self-sustaining ecosystems that suits us. And each individual organization needs to soul search and find that for themselves. And it's a bit of a journey. It's not really a destination. But when you find it, the good news is you don't need to tinker with it at all. All you need to do is to just let it be, and it will thrive. And ever so often, you might want to put in a few things here and there just to make sure that the aesthetics of it is nicer. But the fundamental activity self-propels itself. I think that is the holy grail. So when we talk about management, I mean, from a broader perspective, right, the entire cosmos is managed, right, by universal laws. That there is order to it. Otherwise, we won't exist, right? Imagine there'll be complete chaos, but there's order. So in that sense, but it is self-managed. Nobody's tinkering with it. It tinkers with itself. The checks and balances are inbuilt. That's what organizations need to do. We need to build ecosystems that self-sustains itself and also makes sure that every single person who's occupying that space has an opportunity to truly become the best versions of themselves. You do that and let people be. I think most human beings are capable of self-management. It's just that we don't necessarily manage the way somebody else wants us to. Let me give you a simple example for that, right? So my son and daughter are complete polar opposites.
Right.
Okay. Having been born from the same mother and father. Right. My daughter is a very structured, organized. My son turns around and terms her OCD, which is probably true. But she's a very, very structured person, right? She goes around things in a very, very systematic manner. My son, on the other hand, is the kind of person who wakes up in the morning and then decides what he needs to do, right? Now, he has certain objectives in his mind, but the way he goes about in a complete loose cannon kind of perspective. And we try and tell one of them to adjust how they do things in accordance with what we think is right. I think that's the starting point of all disasters. However, if you can teach my daughter to work on the fly a little bit, at the same time, if you can teach my son a little bit of focus, both of them flourish. But their trigger point and the way they kind of move things fundamentally might be different. But they both know how to do both. That's where we need to be. So the issue is not so much whether we manage the systems around people or the people manage the systems or whatever we play. The fundamental principle you need to understand and have in your head is that the least amount of tinkering we do with it and allow people to kind of organically figure these things out and give that space, I think that's when leadership comes in the most important. And that's what leaders ought to be doing in the first place, allowing the person to find that way. And of course, remember this, right? We are working in organizations. We are not working, in limbo, in absolute nothingness, right? So we have to work with other people. That is when the issue happens. If you're doing something your way, I'm doing something my way, somebody else is doing it some other way. How do you bring all of it together? That is your leadership role coming in. You try and manage that. It's very difficult. One or two things will take place. One is that either some people will be completely disgruntled and leave, or you have to keep tinkering with it all the time, which is exhausting, and it doesn't work out in the first place in the long term. So that, I think, is the crux of leadership.